On June 1st, 2025, we headed to our first camping trip of the summer in York County, South Carolina. So come with us as we spend time exploring what has been called the Charleston of the upstate. On day one, after dropping my eldest son off at camp, we headed to the more rural part of the county. As we crossed over the Catawba River, I couldn't help but think of the native people who once called this place home, mainly because this river was named after them and they were known as the people of the river. Originally, this area was part of what was the very large Craven County, named after William, Earl of Craven, who was born poor but eventually became the Lord Mayor of London. William fought during the 30-Year War. It was during this war that he gained admiration despite becoming a POW and having to be ransomed. As far as we know, William only ever loved one woman, Elizabeth Stuart, who was a British princess. While they never married, he did financially support his lady's brother, Charles I, during the English Civil War. Later, when the monarchy was reestablished by Charles I's son, William and 7 other men were given the title of Carolina as a reward for their continued support. Most notably, William earned the lasting respect and gratitude of the people of London during the Great Plague of 1665. Unlike most of the noblemen in the country who fled, William remained in London, helping to maintain order and donating property for burial grounds. Lastly, during the Glorious Revolution, when King James II was being dethroned for being too Catholic, William swore that he would be cut into pieces rather than hand over the king. But when the king heard, he ordered William to stand down. By the 1730s and 1740s, grants began calling this area Kingston's Township. Then, in 1757, the future York County became associated with St. Mark's Parish. This was followed by becoming part of the Camden Judicial District in 1769, and in 1791 became part of the Pinckneyville Judicial District. But the latter did not last long, as flooding made it hard to establish a town there, in what is the neighboring county of Union. Finally, in 1785, York County was established and named after the king whom William vowed to defend to the death, James II of England, who, prior to ascending the throne, had been known as the Duke of York. Despite that, the early settlers who came here were not Catholic, but rather Protestant. After much discussion about what was North and what was South Carolina, by 1772 York gained additional lands by the correction of old surveys, and this land became known as the New Acquisition. Afterwards, York's size remained relatively the same until 1897, when Cherokee County took York's town of Blacksburg for itself. Most of the early settlers came from the coast of Chester, Lancaster, and York, Pennsylvania, and from the Valley of Virginia. Prior to the Revolutionary War, land grants in the area were already possessed by Anderson Allison, William Allen, William Hanna, John White, William Taylor, Ezekiel Polk, Thomas Knox, and Thomas Ferguson, among others. The previously mentioned Catawba Indians really helped the early settlers, as the Catawba had a farming and hunting culture. The Catawba also became known for their beautiful clay pots, which are still made even today. The Catawba society also had a warlike culture, with their three biggest enemies being the Iroquois, Shawnee, and the Cherokee. While the Catawbas usually sided with the settlers, they did side against the white man during the Yamasee War of 1715. After the war, the native slave trade ceased, and the Catawba took in people from the Wateree and Santee tribes who suffered greatly during the war. When John Lawson, one of the first explorers, made his way to the land of the Catawba, he was amazed by the variety of animals in the area, like panthers, tigers, wolves, and enough ducks and pigeons that the sun was sometimes blocked out. Lawson described the land of what would be York as containing fertile land with large trees and land as red as blood. Unlike some native tribes, the Catawba continued to get along well with the settlers. Unfortunately, as a result, in 1763, the Catawba king, King Hagler, was murdered because of his support of the colonists by 7 Shawnee braves who shot him and then scalped him. Don't be fooled, though. The settlers and native violence occurred here, too. One of the saddest stories occurred in 1754, when a group of travelers stopped at a plantation near Buffalo Creek to rest. 2 of the travelers were deeply in love and decided to leave to become married and then come back. However, when the couple came back, they found 16 of their people lying dead in the yard, killed by those believed to have been the Shawnee or Savannah. They also found that the horses had been released and that all the farm animals had been killed. In addition, 5 people were missing. Among them was 1 woman and 3 children. Governor Glenn tried desperately, even a year later, to find the children, but the children were never seen again. As South Carolina began to fill up, there was a great discrimination between the people of the upcountry and the people of the low country. In general, the people in the low country thought that the people of the upcountry were poor, uneducated ruffians, while the people of the upcountry thought that the people of the low country were untrustworthy, greedy snobs, as they often felt poorly dealt with and were not given political consideration. Soon, when the War of Independence occurred, the state had a hard time unifying, as most of the people in the upcountry didn't want to get involved. Eventually, the low country even sent Patriot William Drayton to the upstate to draw out loyalists to the cause. Our first stop in York County was Bullock Creek Presbyterian Church. The community, the creek, and the church are named after the Bullock family, the patriarch being Zachariah Bullock, an early settler and surveyor who lived on the Packlet River in the mid-1700s. Bullock Creek Presbyterian Church, under leadership of Dr. Joseph Alexander, pastor of 1774 to 1801, organized in 1769. And was a Whig stronghold during the Revolution. 300 yards west is the site of one of the earliest academic academies in Upper South Carolina, established in 1787 by Dr. Alexander. 1.5 miles southwest is the site of Dr. Alexander's home, used as a hospital during the American Revolution. A few miles west to here was the Bullock Creek Academy that Reverend Alexander founded in 1787. The academy was the first classical school in the upcountry. Among his students were Andrew Jackson and William Crawford, a man who Jackson actually ran against in 1781. As a smallpox epidemic occurred, the home of Reverend Alexander was turned into a hospital, making it the first clinic in the backcountry. Around this time, when so many people died from smallpox, the newly acquired vaccine helped save so many lives that the Reverend's home was named Lazaretto. Of the patriots buried here is Joseph Robinson. He had an uncle of the same name. To make things more confusing, they both went by Joe, and there were only 5 years difference between them. However, while Joe Robinson here sided with the Patriot, Uncle Joe sided with the Loyalist. In fact, Uncle Joe was given 2,000 Loyalists to command and was very successful in the area of 96. He and his men eventually had to escape to Florida, where Uncle Joe formed the South Carolina Loyalist and became a colonel. On the other hand, the younger Joe Robinson also gained a reputation as a fighting man, as he was at Hanging Rock, Fish Dam, Blackstock, and Huck's Defeat. During the war, young Joe was saved by his friend Robert Wilson, who, after being caught, convinced the Tories that he was willing to fight for the king, saying, "If a man can learn to fight, he can learn to turn." When they allowed him to go home to gather supplies, instead he went to warn his friend Joe. After the war, Uncle Joe found his home was burned and eventually found himself in Canada, where he lived forever loyal to the king. While young Joe went on to be a father of at least 12 and was eventually laid to rest here at the ripe old age of 86. Another patriot buried here is that of James Kirkpatrick. While the Revolutionary War was raging on, after not seeing his wife Susanna and their 4 sons, James headed home for a short visit. Caught up in their joyous reunion, they didn't realize that the Tories had surrounded their home and were taking deadly aim. James fell dead on his wife's lap. He was the first war casualty and only the 3rd person to be buried here at the cemetery. Yet another man here is James Jameson of Brandywine County. After moving to York, he joined up with William Bratton and Samuel Watson's new acquisition regiment. After some time, the group dissolved, and it was decided it was futile to continue to fight. This so upset Jameson that he gathered a group of 11 men, and they rode off to find and join Sumter. Sumter made Jameson a lieutenant, and while Jameson was captured at least twice during the conflict, he always returned to his duties. Of course, I wanted to come here for my own patriot, Henry Plexico. Henry Plexico was born in 1740 in Cecil, Maryland. Notably, the first of the name Plexico to the United States was Henry Plexico, who was listed in the census in 1790 as a resident of York County, South Carolina. All who bears the name Plexico are lineal descendants of the first Henry Plexico. Henry married Jane Bankhead in Maryland in 1763. By December 23rd of 1784, he had purchased land on Beaver Dam Creek and owned 140 acres, which he paid £50 for. In Dr. George Howe's History of the Presbyterian Church in South Carolina, He states, Bullock Creek Presbyterian Church, of which Henry Plexico was one of the first elders. Henry was known for his dark complexion and eyes, and while the nationality of his forefathers are unknown, many believe that they were either from Italy or Spain. What is known is that Henry had a great love and talent for music. During his life, he fathered at least 5 children: George, John, Mary, Henry, and Margaret. The eldest, George, had a daughter named Nancy, who married a Quinn. She then had a daughter named Nancy, who married a Rippey. Nancy Rippey had a daughter named Harriet, who married a Hamrick. Harriet's daughter, named Molly, married a Martin. Molly Martin then had my great-grandmother, Verl Scoggins, who I was lucky enough to spend my childhood with and have very fond memories of. Notably, many of Henry's descendants have been preachers, teachers, and even politicians. In the Robinson and Plexico book, it talks about a murder, but not just any murder, the murder of John Lee Good, perhaps the most astonishing murder ever committed in York County. John Lee Good, a 12-year-old boy, was killed by Beep when he caught them stealing from his father's cotton. About sunset on the evening of November the 30th of 1886, he was wandering into the fields, and there spied the rogues. Fearing lest they should be exposed, the Beeps determined to kill him. Prindley Thompson, one of the murderers, gave this account in his confession. I went with them after the cotton in Mr. Good's field. Bailey had the boy's wrist. I had his legs. Mose was choking him, and Dan carried the rocks. We all went away by the pasture field. Bailey hit him first with a rock when we first got hold of the boy. Dan saw the boy first. Dan said, "Boys, yonder is Lee." Bailey hit him first and Dan next. Mose jumped on his bowels. They then cut his throat, stuffed him in a ditch, and left him for dead. Eli Roberts, a brother of the murderers, saw what was happened and ran to the house to tell Lee's parents. Lee was brought to the house, where he died at about 9:30 that night. The Beeps were quickly found and put in jail at York. Alarmed by threats of a lynching, Sheriff Glenn sent them to Columbia on December the 14th. About 7 o'clock the following morning, a crowd of about 75 mounted men, undisguised, approached the jail, prepared their axes and sledgehammers, and some armed with shotguns. By the time the sheriff was aroused by the noise, convinced them that the prisoners were not there, and they rode peacefully out of town. On April the 4th, 1887, Mr. W.E. Good, the boy's father, was taken to the state hospital in Columbia. The pitiful sight of him rekindled the anger of many citizens. Sheriff Glenn gave the following testimony. On the morning about 4:30 o'clock, I was awakened from my sleep by the noise at the front portico. I got up and walked out the door without putting on my clothes. When I got to the portico, I found that it was filled with men, completely cutting me off from the avenue leading out the door. They demanded the keys, stating that they were going to lynch those murderers. I told them that I would not give them the keys, and I saw that there were too many for me. I went back to my room, picked up my 6-shooter I had there, and fired as fast as I could in order to raise the alarm that something was going on at the jail. Giles Good, Bailey Doodle, Finley Thompson, Dan Roberts, and Mose Lipscomb. They were led below Yorksville and there hanged on 2 trees. Giles Good on one side of the road and the other 4 on the other side of the road. It is said that Giles Goode, the instigator of the murder, was made to act as executioner and then compelled to tie the knot of his own noose. One account says, he cried out, "How the devil you expect a man to hang himself?" This area really has a lot of history, not only for the patriots buried here. In June of 1780, Lieutenant Chesney commanded a small force of Loyalist men who skirmished with some patriots at Bullock's Creek. The patriots were led by Colonel Thomas Brandon. The skirmish took place as the patriots were attempting to cross the ford at Bullock's Fork. During the conflict, Captain Reed fell behind the others, and he was killed by the Loyalists. His mother, having found out who the murderers were, followed Colonel Brandon to North Carolina and implored him to avenge the death of her son. In addition, only a few miles away, there is a historic marker for Lacey's Fort. Lacey's Fort was a 15-foot log stockade, sometimes called Liberty Hill by patriots, but Patriots' Folly by Loyalists. The fort was built to protect the families in the area and hinder the British. The fort was built by Colonel Edward Lacey on a hilltop near Turkey Creek. From the blockhouse fort, they would monitor the main road, as well as Hamilton and Love Ford on the Broad River. As soon as people had settled their disputes with Britain, they began getting their farms up and concerning themselves with their children's education. An early school in the nearby area was started by 18-year-old Robert Young Russell. His school was held in a refurbished corn crib on his stepfather James Higgs' land. Eventually, Russell closed his school so he could further his own education, but it was restarted in 1830 as the Blairsville Academy by Reverend Aaron Williams, the then pastor of Salem and Bullock Creek Presbyterian. Within the Bullock Creek community, a post office called Bullock Creek operated between 1832 and 1930. The postmaster was Alex Thompson, and he served in 1808 and also operated Thompson's Tanning Yard. By 1853, J.G. Davison was the postmaster and was also associated with a nearby business, but his business was a mercantile business. By 1955, Porter Goode lived in the area. He had been the son of James Goode. Porter married Mary Hughes. Together, Porter and Mary had a nice-sized family that he raised while being a merchant and farmer. During my research, I read a story in which old Porter purchased a 50-horsepower Fairbank Morris engine from William Hill. The engine had been all that had remained from Hill's gin house, which had been burned. Porter rebuilt the engine and used it in his gin, which burned down in 1947. But he was still able to salvage the engine once again and reused it again in 1953 in his sawmill. Amazingly, this motor was used at Porter's sawmill to cut lumber for the new Bullock Creek Church. But afterwards, this sawmill too burnt down. Notably, Mr. Porter is also laid to rest at Bullock Creek Presbyterian. Next, we drove to the town of Sharon, which the community of Bullock Creek is part of. The town of Sharon was established in 1889 when John L. Rainey made land available. John was the son of William and Sarah Rainey, and while they are laid to rest at Bullock Creek, John became a member of and was buried at the Sharon Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church with his wife, Mary Adeline Gilmore Rainey and their sons Willie, John, and Kirby. Near John, his iron cross stands as testament of his service. Sharon Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church was founded in 1796. The church emerged due to a dispute within the congregation of Beersheba over the introduction of Watts hymns, which refers to over 750 hymns written by English minister and theologian Isaac Watts, probably the most famous of these hymns being Joy to the World. Until 1847, the church met in a small log building. The second church was built in 1847, and the third building was built in 1923. And the congregation still worship in that building even to present day. Besides the Rainey family, the churchyard has over 1,000 of the area's people, and it too has its fair share of patriots, including Henry Ray, William Love, Captain Jonathan Beatty, Robert Stevenson, and John Scott, among others, the latter of which fought with Francis Marion in the Low Country. During 1790, York had a little over 6,000 residents, of whom 923 were slaves. During this time, William Hill owned 84 and Dan Williams 24, while most people owned much less. After 20 years, the population increased to 10,000, of whom a little over 3,000 were slaves. That being said, not every white family owned slaves in the area. By 1843, prior to emancipation, the enslaved community worshiped at their own church, Blue Branch Presbyterian. While Blue Branch Presbyterian is the mother church for all other African American churches in the area, it is no longer active today. Camp meetings and special events still occur there, and there is a cemetery there. While I have read various books that contain hate crimes which occurred especially during the Reconstruction era, I openly wept as I read about Ellis Sanders, who was laid to rest at Blue Branch Presbyterian Cemetery. He was the son of Solomon and Madeline Sanders, and was himself a freed slave. While most free people were persuaded to vote Republican, Ellis wanted to vote Democrat. Of course, he got a lot of hate for this. In particular, one person who was very upset after learning about Ellis's political stance was Giles Good, who threatened Ellis with violence, so much so that Ellis told authorities and had him arrested. His good friend, Lum Cranford of Chester County, came over and shot Ellis down as he was leaving church. After being arrested, Cranford claimed that he was innocent and tried to blame Wallace Reed, who was actually planning to kill every black man who voted Democrat. During Cranford's incarceration, he was treated very kindly by the sheriff, who was known to be kind-hearted and hated performing executions, so much so that he once offered to pay someone else to do it. After being convicted, when it came time for Cranford's execution by hanging, Cranford thanked the sheriff, Samuel Youngblood, for being so kind and assured the sheriff that he was not hanging an innocent man and that he did, in fact, shoot Ellis down. Cranford was left hanging for 30 minutes before being brought down and buried. It was only 6 months after the 21-year-old Ellis had been laid to rest at a service that brought the black and white communities together. Later, some of Ellis's friends had a marker placed that read, "Killed for his democratic beliefs." Next, we drove to Wilson's Chapel, now Wilson's AME, which is also the site where a black and white community came together. While conventions between the predominantly white Democratic Party and black Republican Party often occurred separately, it was here at Wilson's Chapel that a meeting was held so both sides could express their views. While this type of meeting also occurred in other areas, unlike many of those meetings, this meeting was deemed peaceful and successful. This meeting occurred in 1876 and was pretty much equally divided. The Republican speaker included John Hannibal White, who spoke on how white Democrats may nullify the civil rights and cause the Civil War to break out again, and Alexander Stewart Wallace. Wallace had switched parties after the Civil War, and because of that, was very hated and often taunted and booed. He was even nicknamed Ass Wallace and Buttermilk Wallace due to having buttermilk thrown on him by Major J.H. Berry at the Rose Hotel dining room. Eventually, the treatment of Wallace in the South got so bad that he was forced to move to Washington for some time. While at this meeting, Wallace merely encouraged the Republicans to defend their liberties and the liberties of colored people. It was also during the Wilson Chapel Convention that Republican Major Hart continued to point out how whites chose to free the slaves so they could be trusted, followed by Democrat Isaac D. Witherspoon, whose speech was the most emotionally charged as he deeply apologized and thanked the colored men who took care of the area and the vulnerable women during the Civil War. Witherspoon pointed out the terrible mistakes of the past. After deeply apologizing, he described why the white men should not be seen as the enemy and how the town's men should work together. Notably, both speakers, Republican Wallace and Democrat Witherspoon, are buried at York's own Rose Hill Cemetery. Anyway, I wanted to see that cemetery, but it's down somebody's road, and I'm not trying to trespass. The town of Sharon grew up around and took its name from Sharon Associate Presbyterian Reformed Presbyterian Church, which existed here in 1800 when the Charleston, Cincinnati, and Chicago Railroad came through in 1800s. John L. Rainey donated the land for the station, and the town was incorporated by the South Carolina General Assembly in 1889. L. Rainey, owner of large tracts of land on which Sharon was established, conveyed land to the Presbyterian Church in 1889, and in 1898 the Methodist in 1897, and the Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in 1904. The First National Bank, established here in 1909, was the only bank in western York County and survived the Depression. The Hill Bank and Mercantile Company was founded here prior to 1915. In 1903, Reverend Robert Armstrong Ross was laid to rest and buried at Sharon Associate Reformed Presbyterian Churchyard. Reverend R.A. Ross was the pastor of Sharon Presbyterian Church for 50 years. He was married twice, first to Nancy Kennedy Ross in July 1846, and second to Naomi Caldwell Ross in September 1854. During a particular sermon, Reverend Ross condemned a local man, Elias Ramsey, for his moonshine production and stated that God should send a storm and wash Ramsey's evil still away. In fact, this did occur, but Ramsey didn't stop producing moonshine. Afterwards, while delivering his moonshine, Ramsey tried to stay away from Reverend Ross's home. But one day, his deliveries led him right by the Reverend's home. In a strange change of heart, Reverend Ross ran and talked to Ramsey and regularly began buying moonshine from him for medicinal purposes, which Ross used while visiting the sick and to treat the face of the recently deceased to stop discoloration. In 1919, Sharon was home to the Perfectly Protected Possum Club, which was a group of female hunters. Their club's name came about after it was discovered none of the girls had a hunting license, causing all of them to subsequently obtain one. The girls were often escorted by champion possum hunter Walter Maloney. And on Tuesday nights, Mrs. Maloney would prepare a baked possum and sweet potato feast that got so popular the dinner became standing room only. In 1921, as property tax wasn't yet a thing, police were paid through fines. So in 1921, Sharon's second policeman resigned to move to York, which had far more crime. That being said, when Mayor Dennis Wheatland posted the job, 87 men applied, one being W.A. Settlemeyer, a Kings Mountain policeman. However, Settlemeyer only lasted 12 hours. It is written that after 3 heartless, drunk men came into town, Settlemeyer tucked his tail and ran out. This was what was published in the York newspaper. Unfortunately, according to Settlemeyer, the truth is he left due to the lack of organization, equipment, and pay. Sharon was once home to the First National Bank, where a farmer and an important civic leader, John S. Hartness, worked as a cashier manager. John's farm was known as the Old Hefner Place near Turkey Creek, and it was on this farm that he raised cattle and planted various crops. In 1929, John, like many, used an experimental crop to prevent erosion, and of course, it was kudzu. It was also in 1929 that the remains of a 24-year-old Faye Wilson King was found near her outhouse here in Sharon. After friends and family went out to look for her, she was found by the daughter of Plexico. Her husband, who had been riddled with illness that day, called for the assistance of neighbors to help find her. When she was found, she had small bottles of poison in her hand. When the husband was questioned about the suicide, he told the police that yes, she'd been very depressed and had even asked if he would consider poisoning himself with her. Mr. King stated that she was pregnant, and because of a medical condition, she thought that the pregnancy would kill her. Arrangements were made, and Mrs. King's body was moved. During this time, one of the ladies at the home found a dress for Mrs. King to be buried in, but when she went to iron it, the iron didn't work. That night, the husband was so overwhelmed, morphine had to be administered. While at home, someone noticed how the floor in the kitchen was wet, but so many people had been in and out of the home that it was overlooked. Next, at least 2 people noticed that coals in the fireplace were very hot, even though Mr. King said that the fire had been out earlier that day, and that it was that aroused his worry about his wife's whereabouts. Upon the autopsy, a small hole was found in Mrs. King's forehead, but it appeared to be a superficial, possibly from a fall, and while her lips and lungs had acid burns from the poison, that was not determined to be what caused her death. It was also noted that there was a bruising pattern associated with her hands, as if a cord had been used. In addition, she was not pregnant. Investigators quickly went back to the home, where they found several areas throughout the house which looked as if it had been cleaned more recently. Upon exploring the attic, a pile of bloody clothes were found that belonged to Mrs. King, as they bore her initials. Mr. King's trial was held in Chester County to ensure fairness. Many testified that the Kings were strapped for cash and that Mrs. King had a $9,000 life insurance policy. In addition, Mr. King wanted to move, but Mrs. King refused. While Mrs. King was buried at Mountain Rest Cemetery in Kings Mountain, Mr. King passed away on June 8, 1949, at the age of 57 in Columbia, and was buried at the Sunset Cemetery in Shelby, North Carolina. In 1935, the village of Sharon had the Women's Roosevelt for Re-election Club, whose president was Mrs. James D. Grist. To raise money for Roosevelt's campaign, the group hosted a beef hash picnic and raffled off a homemade patriotic quilt, which sold to a group of men including F. M. Millett, Sam Pritt, and W. L. Hill, who paid $150 for the quilt, which was quite a lot during the Depression. In 1938, the people of Sharon made friends with a pet crow named Jim. While Jim was mainly known as Smith Hobbs' pet crow, the bird was often perched on cars outside of the post office, Buck Youngblood's store, Kennedy's Variety Store, Hobbs Groceries, Rainey's Gin, or Ernest Doodle's filling station. Apparently, in an effort to get attention, Jim was very vocal and for some time was a familiar sight. In 1943, at Woodlawn Presbyterian, Dr. Joseph Say was laid to rest. He was an early doctor in the area. His father was Reverend James Hodge Say of Fishing Creek in Chester, and his mother, Rebecca, was from the notable McJunkin family of Union County. Dr. Say married Ella J. Rainey and was the father of 4 children. He was a well-respected and loved county doctor for over 60 years in his community. And I found several interesting stories about him. The first involves him and his assistant stealing a body of a man who had been hung in York County for murder, which was an act that had also been done earlier by another doctor, Dr. Bratton. In another story, Dr. Say comes to the rescue of a woman with a terrible abscessed tooth. During the extraction, she made quite a commotion due to the pain. Dr. Say wrote that after the extraction, her brother promised me to remove one of his teeth so he could prove to her that it wasn't that big of a deal, and quoted, "Finally it came out, a big fellow with 4 roots and as perfect as it could be. Sure enough, there was never a squawk out of him." Olivet's Presbyterian was founded by Reverend Robert Young Russell on September 17th of 1842 as a part of the Old Independence Presbyterian Church. The first church was a small wooden building situated about 3 miles west of McConnell's on what is now Highway 322. Mr. Thomas Burris, a member of the church, made the pews, which are still in use even today. The old church building was abandoned and worship began in the present building on September the 19th of 1886 in the new brick church not far from the railroad. It is a Gothic style and is beautiful with its shrubbery, green lawn, and cement walk. While the cemetery associated with this church isn't old enough to have patriots, it does have soldiers from other wars, like John M. Lindsay and Thomas E. Burris, both of whom died during the war between the states, as well as Marion Davis Lever, who fought during World War I, and Thomas Wilson Jr., who fought during World War II. McConnell's can trace its origins to a colonial trading post located at the intersection of two wagon roads. McConnell's, like the city of York and Chester, is situated on a natural elevated ridge that runs north to south. The land gradually slopes off to both sides of the ridge in a well-watered area containing numerous creeks and spring branches. The South Fork of Fishing Creek begins just east of McConnell and enters the Catawba River near Chester County. The headwaters of Turkey Creek lie immediately to the north and west of McConnell's, and these streams join together to enter the Broad River in Chester County. One of the earliest settlers in what would eventually become McConnell's was William Moore, a member of a large Scots-Irish family who settled on Upper Fishing Creek in the 1750s. On April 8, 1754, Moore received a 300-acre North Carolina land grant on ye South Fork of Fishing Creek, adjoining branches of Turkey Creek. This was during a period when present-day York County was claimed by North Carolina, and Moore's grant was located in what was then considered to be Anson County. After 1754, the French and Indian War slowed the influx of settlers to the area. But once the war ended in 1763, settlers continued to come to the area. By this time, the area was considered to be part of the newly formed Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. A trader and surveyor named John Wade settled on one of the old wagon roads near modern McConnell and built a store or trading post there sometime prior to 1764. His earliest land record, a 300-acre Mecklenburg grant, was surveyed on August the 19th of 1764. Matthew Floyd was a wealthy planter and a colonial tax collector. Floyd would later gain notoriety during the Revolutionary War as the commander of a Loyalist militia regiment at the Battle of Huck's Defeat. Among other early families who settled in the McConnell area prior to the American Revolution are many familiar names to modern McConnell, such as Ashe, Bratton, Burris, Love, Lowry, McKnight, Neely, Rainey, Sadler, Steele, Wallace, Williamson, and finally, just before the outbreak of the American Revolution, the McConnell family. Around 1769, these early settlers established Bethesda Presbyterian Church, which became the first Christian church in the vicinity and provided a focal point for future settlement. In an 1820 survey, no actual town yet existed at the crossroads. However, that began to change in 1848 with the construction of the railroad. The crossroad near the McConnell plantation, located almost exactly halfway between Chesterville and Yorkville, was a natural place to put a railroad depot with a water tank and firewood supplies. As the railroad was being finished, Joseph P. Moore and Hughes Burris opened a small store nearby selling dry goods. The first postmaster was Joseph P. Moore, who operated the post office out of the same building as his store. By the time of the Civil War, men in the area joined the Turkey Creek Guards, the Turkey Creek Grays, which became Company E and Company I of the 5th South Carolina Infantry Regiment, as well as the Lacey's Guards, which became Company K of the 17th South Carolina Infantry Regiment. Finally, by 1906, McConnell was incorporated into a town. After the Kings Mountain Railroad was completed in 1852, the McConnell Post Office was established in 1854. The town, named for the McConnell family, was incorporated in 1906.
The first intendant was J.T. Crawford. Wardens were J.F. Ashe, S.H. Love, J.O. Moore, and J.M. Williams. The post office was renamed McConnell's in 1951.
Of course, you can't go to McConnell's without visiting its living history village known as Brattonsville and the location of Huck's defeat. Prior to this important battle on June 18th of 1780, a group of British Legion cavalry commanded by Captain Christian Huck was ordered to destroy Hill's Ironworks. The ironworks consisted of a store, a furnace, and several mills. The ironworks was being guarded by about 50 Patriot militiamen when two men rode up and warned the militia that a force of 200 to 300 enemy dragoons were on their way. After the brief skirmish, most of the Patriot militia fled, while 7 were killed and 4 Patriots were taken prisoner. Captain Huck then burned Hill's Ironworks and confiscated about 90 slave laborers. By July 12th, Colonel Thomas Brandon regrouped his men of the 2nd Spartan Regiment of Militia after their defeat at Brandon's camp. Colonel Brandon took most of his 50 men around the rear of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Love's sister's home and left Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Love with 16 men out front. It is documented that during this time, Lieutenant Colonel Love's sister ran out of the house to beg her brother not to attack. When he refused, she returned to the house, and when she entered the front door, a stray bullet came in from the rear and killed her. The Loyalists held out for a short time and then raised the white flag on the barrel of a rifle. Since this did not look too peaceful to the Patriots, a bullet was put through the rifleman's arm. The rifle disappeared and quickly was raised again, now on a musket ramrod. This time, the offer for the truce was accepted. Colonel Brandon had 1 man wounded, Thomas Kennedy, while the Loyalists lost 2 and had 4 wounded and 28 captured. On the same day, depending on your source, the Battle of Williamson's Plantation, also known as the previously mentioned Huck's defeat, occurred. This battle was a result of Huck's forces being in the area. Notably, his force did consist of elements of Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton's hated British Legion, the Green Dragoons, the New York Volunteers, and also a large body of Loyalist militia. For over a month, these troops were based at Rocky Mount in Fairfield County and had roamed around the upstate, destroying homes and terrorizing the area. Captain Christian Huck arrived at Brattonsville on the evening of July 11th with 115 British Loyalists and threatened Bratton's wife Martha with her life if she refused to reveal the location of her husband to them. Captain Huck then encamped his men in a field surrounding the house of James Williamson, a neighbor of Bratton's. Unknown to Captain Huck, several companies of local Patriot militia were proceeding from Colonel Thomas Sumter's camp in what is now northern Lancaster County for the purpose of interceding and halting the British provincials' advance. The Patriots were commanded by several well-known militia officers from York, Chester, and Fairfield counties, including Lieutenant Colonel Bratton, Lieutenant Colonel William Hill, Colonel Andrew Neal, Colonel Edward Lacey, Colonel Richard Wynne, Captain John McClure, and Captain John Moffett. The combined Patriot force, consisting of about 250 mounted soldiers, rode through the night and arrived at Williamson's home before daylight on the 12th and made plans for a dawn attack. At daybreak, as the enemy was just climbing out of their bedrolls, the attack began. Surprised by the suddenness of the attack, the provincials were thrown into chaos. Twice the enemy tried unsuccessfully to mount a counterattack. Dashing from the Williamsons' house, Captain Huck swung up onto his horse and waved his sword, attempting to rally his force to meet the rebel threat. Thomas Carroll, sighting Captain Huck, took aim and shot the enemy leader in the head. The British then lost what organized resistance they had, and the fight became a running battle back south towards the Brattons' house, where some of the last fighting took place. The battle lasted a little over an hour and costed the provincials 25 to 50 men who were killed. In addition, several times that number were wounded and 29 captured. As was custom for both sides during the war in the back country, mercy was not freely given upon successful completion of a battle. Several of those captured were later hanged. The only Patriot casualty reported was a man by the name of Campbell. While in McConnell, we stopped at Bethesda. Bethesda came into existence in 1760 and is one of the 4 original Presbyterian churches in the state's Old York District. The church was formally organized in 1769 by Reverend William Richardson. In 1771, John Fondren donated the land here for a second frame church built in 1780, but it was burned. Reverend Robert B. Walker, the first permanent minister, served here in 1794 to 1834. The cemetery dates back to 1777, and this brick church was built in 1820. The brick building is actually the 3rd building associated with this church. From 1800 to 1863, the congregation held large camp meetings associated with the Second Great Awakening. A story of one of these camp meetings occurred in 1802 after the church's pastor, Reverend Walker, came back from a tent revival in Kentucky. Reverend Walker was so moved that he spoke about his experience while preaching in the Waxhaws. He told how the Spirit of God so filled the place that the people began to fall down in confession. Shortly after, the congregation to whom he spoke began to have the falling down experience. While some thought that this was due to the power of persuasion, George Dale thought it was demonic and ran away. Whatever the case, some did experience deliverance from their sins, like alcoholism. Among those buried here is Colonel William Bratton. Colonel William Bratton was born in 1740 in Rockbridge County, Virginia, to his father, who was also named William. Colonel William was the grandson of Andrew, who had come to America from Ireland. Colonel William was one of 5 Bratton brothers, John, Robert, Thomas, and Hugh, and one sister, Jean B. Guy. Colonel William either came to the area with his siblings or they shortly came afterwards, prior to the Revolutionary War. When the war did break out, Colonel William made quite a name for himself for being a zealous leader who fiercely believed in independence. After the war, he served in legislature. During his life, he married Martha Robinson, and together they had 9 children, of which 2 became doctors. When Colonel William passed away in 1815 at the age of 74, he was remembered as being a strictly honest, virtuous, and good man. While people have always enjoyed a good scary tale, there are at least 2 men buried here who believed at one time they were bewitched. One is Moses Gabby, affectionately known as Mosey. He moved in with his sister Elizabeth Burns in 1820. It was during this time that he began waking up every night and letting out a terrible scream, then running out of the home not to return until the morning. This would occur regardless of the weather, and every morning he would come back and his young niece would help him pick chestnut burrs from his hair. Finally, Mosey confessed to his sister that he had been bewitched, and every night he was forced to go to old Violet Weston's place, where he was tied up to a chestnut tree and forced to watch a group of witches. After several attempts to help Mosey by his family and neighbors, it became more apparent that Mosey may not be lying. Eventually, things got so bad, the family had a man from Lincolnton, North Carolina, come help. When the man arrived, so did many of the townspeople. First, Mosey was given something to drink, which made him vomit. While many of the spectators didn't believe in all of this, many did change their mind after he began vomiting up hairpins and needles. Next, the North Carolina man produced a black cat, which he tied to a chair and hit 9 times with a switch. He then asked Mosey to do the same. After repeating this several times, the North Carolina man told Mosey that the one who had cursed him would soon show themselves and that she would come to borrow something, and that first she must be denied, but then give her whatever she asked for, and that will break the curse. Later that day, an old woman by the name of Mrs. Biggert came over and asked for some buttermilk. This could have been coincidence, but after being denied, she refused to leave. After some time, Mosey gave her the milk, and she left. Was she truly a witch? Who knows? But Mosey never again cried out or left the house at night. The other man, laid to rest here, who had some sort of supernatural experience, was Adam Meek. It all began when people started seeing a ghostly figure in a certain field near Bullock Creek. The figure was eventually seen so much that Adam Meek, York County Sheriff, was called upon. Adam was the brother of Major James Meek and the son-in-law of Captain William Byers. Not only that, but Meek also served in the Revolutionary War and saw action at Briar Creek, Rocky Mount, Hanging Rock, Fishing Creek, Fish Dam Ford, Blackstock's Plantation, Biggins Church, and Utah Springs. So he was a non-nonsense sort of man. Adam had no worries about investigating. It is said that when Adam met up with the apparition, it followed alongside him for a while as he rode horseback. For apparently 200 yards, Adam and the apparition talked with each other until he reached the woods and it vanished. The experience did shake up Meek, as he refused to divulge what the spirit had told him. To make the situation more mysterious, a few weeks later, Adam vanished. His wife Anne, children, and the community were out of their minds with worry. But 2 months later, Adam reappeared and told everyone they would never see the ghost of Gordon's old fields again. Adam never revealed what he and the phantom talked about or what had happened to him, but the ghost never appeared again. Sadly, Adam only lived to be 47. While there isn't much to see or do in Smyrna, it's still an interesting place, as it's known for being the smallest town in South Carolina. The area also has an early history that includes an iron furnace. The furnace was developed in 1815 by Jacob Strapp, sometimes pronounced Stroop, and Edward Fewell. But by 1825, the furnace was purchased by some New York investors and eventually took on the name of Jackson's Furnace Site. It is one of only 2 sites that can be associated with the Kings Mountain Iron Company, which operated from 1815 to about 1860. I found this super interesting as I am related to Strapps. Apparently, Jacob was the son of Patriot Adam Strapp, and his wife, Catherine. Jacob was born on March 18, 1771, in Valley Forge, Chester County, Pennsylvania. Jacob was a pioneer furnace builder of German descent. It appears that Jacob may have been married 3 times, to Elizabeth Dillinger, next to Maria Hannah Hoyle, and finally to Sarah Jennings. Jacob married his last wife, Sarah, when he lived in Georgia, which is where he is buried at Goodson Cemetery. Of his wives, he had 10 children with his first, none with his second, and 4 with his third. Of all these children, only one stayed in South Carolina, and it was a daughter, Mary S. White, who is now laid to rest at the Smyrna ARP Church. Anthony X. Cushman was once the editor of 2 of York's first newspapers, and was so impressed with the area's iron production that he believed that Smyrna, along with Kings Creek, would make York County the top metal producer in the nation. Cushman not only envisioned a thriving iron industry, but also believed the county's 2 mineral springs, Piedmont and Sutton Springs, would continue to make the county a tourist destination. But today, these medicinal springs are now only a memory known to few. By 1832, several families began to move to the area that is in the general area of Kings Creek. Among these residents were William McGill from Crowder's Creek, North York, and 3 families with the last name Black who came from Abbeville. It was the McGills and the Blacks which started Smyrna ARP Church, first by having Reverend Thomas Kitchen preach at the McGills' home. In 1835, John Darvin donated the land for the church, and a small log church was erected. During those early years, various German preachers would visit, like L.C. Martin, E. Harris, and John and David Presley. By 1843, the church was formally organized by Reverend R.C. Greer and is believed to be the source of the town's name. Previously mentioned R.A. Ross, who served at Olivet, also served here and was paid $122 a year by Smyrna. The second minister to serve here was Reverend J.R. Vastal, who also preached at Sardis, which at the time was in Union County. By 1891, Reverend J.P. Knox was pastor in Smyrna and at a church in Hickory Grove. Jump forward to 1943, and the church was struck by lightning and burned to the ground. So the congregation met in the school until a new church was constructed. On one of the busier roads in Smyrna is the Ramsey Martin Cemetery. Some of the people buried there include Morgan Martin Sr. and his wife, Jane Ramsey Martin, whose son Thomas had my great-great-great-grandmother, Christina Martin Peeler. While you wouldn't know it now, the area and surrounding counties were once like California in that many people came here looking for gold. In 1851, the newspaper recorded that Jacob Morgan and his sons found wedges of gold. In fact, by July of that year, a sheep's head nugget was found. It was pure gold and weighed 21.5 pounds. Nugget was found on Morgan Martin's steel yard. It is said that Morgan hired John Wiley Moss to carry the nugget to the large Hale gold mine to have it sold, but what happened to the nugget remains a mystery. By 1888, a railroad depot was built by the Charleston, Cincinnati, and Chicago Railroad, a forerunner to the Southern Railway. Shortly after, F.D. Horn built a mercantile business nearby. In more recent news, in 2024, there was a Smyrna Muscadine Festival. After exploring Smyrna, we decided to go to Black's Peaches for lunch. Unfortunately, they weren't serving at that time, so I missed out on their chicken pot pie, which is supposed to be wonderful. Next, we picked up my eldest son from day camp and went to our campground at Allison Creek. Allison Creek Campground is brand new and is located in York County's Allison Creek Park, which is a 106-acre park located on the shores of Lake Wylie. Allison Creek offers guests a wide variety of day-use recreational opportunities and includes 4 boat ramps, a kayak launch, a fishing dock, 3 miles of trails, a playground, and picnic shelters. As far as the campground at Allison Creek, it has 33 full hookup RV campsites and 16 primitive tent sites. After exploring our campground at Allison Creek, we decided to walk around the nearby Clay Hill Graveyard. The graveyard is actually very close to Allison Creek Presbyterian. On February 4th of 1854, Allison Creek Presbyterian was organized. John Durham Currents donated the land on which the church was built. He was the brother of Mrs. Susan Currents Allison, who was present with her husband, William B. Allison, and helped organize the church. The first pastor was Reverend J.R. Bayard, who served from 1854 to 1856. Founded in 1854 by residents of the Clay Hill community, including members of Bethel and Ebenezer Presbyterian, Allison Creek Presbyterian is known to have had African American members. The church was initially a church for both white and black members, with a separate graveyard for black members. The black cemetery, known as the Clay Hill Cemetery, was used until 1896, and it contains about 300 graves, 14 with engraved stones, and the rest marked by mere field stones or unmarked. After 1865, black members of Allison Creek left to form Union Baptist in 1892, Liberty Hill AME Zion in 1896, and New Hope Zion in 1897. Of the notable black citizens of Clay Hill was Ellis Hill. Ellis Hill was a former enslaved man who led a migration of freed slaves from York County to Liberia, Africa in 1871. It is a well-known fact that after the Civil War, it was a dark period for South Carolina and the history of this county, as many hate crimes and the KKK emerged. As a result, there were many murders, whippings, beatings, and other forms of aggregated assault. Hill and his followers were victimized by the Klan during Reconstruction. Before he left, he testified before a congressional committee on the atrocities that they had suffered. Things became so bad that by 1877, Grant ordered federal troops to the area and the county was placed under martial law. Thankfully, by the time Rutherford Hayes removed the Federals, the KKK had already rapidly declined. Today, there is an on-site marker at Allison Creek Presbyterian Church that commemorates Elias Hill and the Liberian migration. As of today, it is the only historic marker in York County that mentions the Klan. The graveyard has only recently been restored, with markers and walking paths. The church is home to the annual Let the Land Say Amen festival, guided tours of the church and its historic cemetery, as well as a short film on the history of the church and its connection to Liberia are available.